Good morning, students, teachers, and staff. This is Mr. Edgecombe, the very proud principal here at Palm Beach Central High School. We have an outstanding school that is very rich in diversity. Our diversity is our strength. Our goal is to always maintain a positive culture where everyone feels welcomed. Although we spend a lot of time talking about academic goals and school grades, at the end of the day, our goal is to prepare you for life after school. Our vision and mission is to encourage our students to become responsible citizens, lifelong learners, and leaders in a global community. Today, we are honored to have a Holocaust child survivor, Mr. Allan Hall. He will be sharing his wealth of knowledge and his heart with our students and staff. We have students viewing this presentation live in the cafeteria, in our classrooms, and some virtually at home. I ask that you give Mr. Hall your undivided attention. He will share a wealth of knowledge, and I ask that you listen and process every important fact that he shares this morning. Thank you again for joining us in this very important Holocaust presentation. Now at this time, I will turn the presentation over to our social studies instructor, Ms. Holzer.
Good morning, everyone, and thank you for joining us for this very special event. In 1979, Congress established the Days of Remembrance, our nation's annual commemoration of the Holocaust. Each year, in April, our nation comes together to remember the victims of the Holocaust, to honor the survivors, and to pay tribute to the liberators. Between 1933 and 1945, the Nazis systematically murdered 6 million Jews and 5 million others. This event, more than any other, teaches us the dangers of hatred, discrimination, prejudice, and assigning one group as the other. The reason that this commemoration remains a moral imperative is so that we do not become indifferent, so that we remember the humanity in all of us, and so that we do not remain silent. Memory shapes us, it teaches us, and it helps to create a better society by showing us how to not make mistakes of the past. Elie Wiesel famously said, "For the dead and the living, we must bear witness. Not only are we responsible for the memories of the dead, we are responsible for what we do with those memories." Before I introduce our guest, I want to remind our students to please submit your Google Forms during the presentation with questions or comments. Ms. Kimberly Coombs will be posing the questions at the end of Mr. Hall's presentation, and he has graciously agreed to answer your questions. We are so lucky to have a special guest with us today as we commemorate the Days of Remembrance. I am honored to introduce our guest speaker. Allan Hall was just 4 years old when the Germans invaded Poland in 1939. Allan had a wonderful childhood with loving parents and extended family. Once the Germans invaded Poland, everything changed for Allan and his family. As the Nazis took control, restrictions on Jews tightened. The family had to leave their hometown of Cracow. This began Allan's journey to survive. Constantly under threat, he survived ghetto, roundup, wars, and years in hiding in constant fear and danger. His story, which he has graciously chosen to share with us today, is one of hope, love, resilience, and courage. On behalf of the students of Palm Beach Central High School, I am honored to introduce you to Mr. Allan Hall.
Thank you very much. The first thought that comes to mind is why are we doing this? Why are you learning about the Holocaust? Is it really important to you that 6 million Jews, 11 million people were murdered in cold blood in Europe 75 years ago? What's the significance to you? Why are you being taught this? Why are you being forced to learn this? Why? Well, as we recently learned, democracy is very, very easy to lose. And you don't know what's around the corner. Does it impact you personally? You bet. Life in in despotism is totally different than democracy. Look around the world. People are risking their lives from all over the world to legally and illegally come to the United States. Why? Yes, there are economic benefits to coming to this country. But in addition to that, there's something much more important. Why would a person take their children, 5, 6, 7-year-olds, and put them into the United States unescorted? Can you imagine a parent doing that? Can you imagine the level of desperation? Well, let me tell you more about it from personal experience. And by the way, those who never study and or do not remember history are condemned to repeat it. That's the word of warning. Well, having said that, I was 4.5 years old when the war started, and I was privileged. I was my parents' only child. I was my grandparents' only grandchild. I was the only nephew. There were no nieces. No matter what I wanted, and I really mean no matter what I wanted, I could get it. And if I asked more than once, I could probably get more than one copy of it. Economically, we were not rich, but well off. My dad and mom were well educated. My mother was a professional musician, a violinist. My dad was an insurance executive, educated in Vienna. By the way, interestingly, he grew up in Poland, but yet he was educated in Vienna. The reason for that is in Poland, there was a quota system. We've had quota systems here in the United States. And what that means is education institutions will not take more students than a quota permits. Quota can be numerical, it can be percentage-wise. My dad was the youngest of 6 children. And so by the time his turn came around, he could no longer go to a Polish university. So part of his high school and his university was spent in Vienna, where he learned German and he went to college. Interestingly, though, the school system that he graduated from was the same school system that Hitler attended. And to a great extent, that saved us. Well, it was obvious that war was about to start, and something happened in my home of origin, which was very unusual for us. Mom and Dad started arguing. For these upward mobile people, yuppies, if you will, arguing, raising voice, etc., was unheard of. It was below their class. But nevertheless, the conversation got more and more heated. Not just one conversation. It went on for days. The conversation went like this. Dad said, I read German periodicals and newspapers. I know what the Nazis intend for Jews. And we better get out of here because Cracow was closer to the border. My mother said, you're crazy. The Germans are amongst the best educated people. They are the most cultured people. Here in Cracow, 25% of the people were of German ancestry. There is nothing to fear. Well, this went on and on and on. Finally, in desperation, my dad said, my hometown is Lvov, which is in eastern Poland, now in Ukraine. Those borders move back and forth. And I'm going to take the boy, me, by the hand, and we're going to go to Lvov. By that time, the war already started. My mother looked at us and said, what are you doing? And my father repeated. And she for the first time realized that he was really serious. Well, she grabbed three things that she thought were most important. She grabbed her fur coat. That was the most expensive thing that she owned. And she grabbed a chest of silver. That was the most expensive thing that the family owned that could be moved. And she also grabbed the family album. Put them all in a stroller, and we went outside. Well, 2, 3, 4 days after the war started, we could find no transportation going from Cracow to Lvov. You see, in a war zone, the first thing that breaks down is the public transportation. In fact, we couldn't even hire a taxi or a car or a truck. Trains were out of commission. There were no buses that were going. The roads were cluttered with military and with refugee traffic. So we were stuck. The only way we could travel is by foot. And in fact, we walked the distance, like from Miami to Orlando. It's the same distance, or perhaps from twice the distance from Orlando to Jacksonville. At any rate, by car, not a challenge, but by foot, in wartime, yes, it was a challenge. So we started walking without any provisions, and sure enough, we would go to somebody's house to see whether we could rest or perhaps get a meal. And basically, we became beggars. My parents did not have any substantial sum of cash, just what happened to be in their pocket. And so in some places, people would treat us very well. They would give us a bowl of soup. They would give us some other food. Others would let us sleep overnight. Yet still, many others would just turn us away. People are people. They behave fairly predictably. At any rate, very slowly we made our way. And finally, we came to a river. The name of that river, by the way, in case you want to look it up, is Bug, B-U-G. And it runs from north, if I remember correctly, from northwest to southeast. And it divides Poland into two unequal parts. When we came to that river, my mother couldn't swim, my dad couldn't swim, and for sure, I couldn't either. We found out there was a ferry a couple of miles up the river. We walked to the ferry, and we just caught it before it left. It was a flat-bottom boat, just big enough for a horse and a wagon, and because people like us were desperate to cross the river, they let a single line of people on one side stand right next to the wagon and horse. Same on the other side. And one man in the front was pulling us across the river with a rope. The other man was pushing us with a pole, poling across the river. And that way we got across the river. Well, you might ask, why am I telling you this story? You see, in a war zone, you have no idea what's going on. All you know is that there's war around you. Sometimes we could see, because we walked through the backwoods, through the country roads, we found that the main roads were being strafed and bombed by the Germans. And were used by the military, and they would be used by the refugees. And so the way to do it safely, so we went through back paths and secondary and tertiary roads parallel to the main highways, but not on them. Sometimes we could see the highways. Occasionally, by the way, we saw the Germans. Okay, sometimes we would fall behind their lines, but they moved on the main highways. So we were sometimes ahead of them, other times behind them. But we were not we did not come across the Nazi soldiers. At any rate, we got to the river, crossed the river on this flat bottom ferry boat, and without knowing it, we left the Nazi-controlled part of Poland and entered the Soviet-controlled part of Poland. What we did not know was that the Soviets had a pact, an agreement with the Germans. They took that part of Poland, eastern part, which was when we came up to the River Bug, and the Nazis took the western part, which is the larger part, up to the River Bug. We crossed the river, and by so doing, we incurred reasonable safety. And for 20 months, we gained life because the Germans almost immediately started inflicting heavy restrictions on the Jews of the western part of Poland. Well, shortly thereafter, we got to Lvov, and we joined my dad's mother, who was there, and he had a brother and sister. He was well connected, got a job, we got an apartment, and life came back to normal. But my mother was just heartbroken. She never got a chance to say goodbye to her parents, to her sister, to her friends. And the reason why not is because my dad refused for her to do that. He knew that it would take days and days to say goodbye to all the people that she wanted to say goodbye to. And thus, that we just didn't have that time. We needed to leave, actually, before we left, but certainly not later. And so she never got a chance to say goodbye. She wrote letters to her mother, to her sister, to her dad, cousins, to friends. And she went to her grave here in the United States in 1990. She died in 95. Never knowing why not a single letter was ever replied to, or why she never received a response, never received even a return letter. On a trip to Poland, which I did after she died, I found out she didn't get any correspondence back because the Jews were rounded up, taken to a square in Cracow, and from there by truck were taken to Plaszow concentration camp, and from there in time they were taken to Auschwitz concentration camp. So my mother was writing letters to dead people. That's why there was never a reply. That's why there was never any return from these letters. At any rate, we were living a perfectly normal life until June 1941, when the Nazis attacked the Soviets. We knew no people further west, and so we had no place to go. So we had to just hunker down, and we lived as quiet and sheltered life as possible. My dad continued going to work, and for us, I didn't stop playing outside. And by the way, I did in Krakow before we left, did experience some anti-Semitism, but in Lvov, very little, because I never went outside and had very little contact with people. And in time, we got a little card that said you had to leave the address, the apartment that we lived in, leave all the furniture, all the contents. We take one suitcase only with us, and we had to go move to somewhere else. Well, we assumed that we had some nice things. We lived in a beautiful apartment. My dad had a good job, which he kept on doing, and that some Nazi officer wanted this nice place for himself. Well, we went with our one suitcase to this other place, and it was strange. There was another family living there. And so we couldn't figure it out, but we were told that we had to shared the apartment. So they were first there. They took the large bedroom. We took the small bedroom. It was a 2-bedroom apartment. And we tried to make things work out. Surprise, a third family showed up and said they were ordered to live in this apartment also. So we had no choice, and we made things work out. But at that point on, I hardly ever left that bedroom. Mind you, at this point I was 7 years old. And my dad, one time coming back home from work, met somebody, and I assume it was a policeman. And the policeman said, you have a son, don't you? Or you have a child? My dad replied, yes. Better get him out of town. There's going to be a roundup. Well, my parents couldn't understand. Why would anybody want to round up children? It made no sense. But out of abundance of caution, they secured a safe house in the country, hired a man to take me, a railroad worker, to the railroad because they couldn't go. Jews were no longer permitted to go into railroads, or for that matter of fact, to parks, or to libraries, or even to a hospital. And this man showed up in uniform, and we went. I didn't want to go, but I knew I had to. And we went to the railroad station. On the way there, the street in front of me was blocked by a truck. And they just pulled up, and the German troopers jumped off the back of the truck. Behind us, this street was blocked out by another truck. And I was the first child taken in that children's roundup. They put me on the back of the truck. I was kept my mouth shut. My guide disappeared, and I just sat there and watched and listened. And to my horror, I never saw, but I heard the parents, the screaming, the crying, as children were being wrestled away from their parents. And two by two, the Nazis came down, and one child in each hand, and brought them on a truck, put them to the truck, put them on a truck with me. And when the truck was absolutely full, we drove off. I thought we went to a police station, but I now think we went to a concentration camp. We were put into a corral, and there was a partition. Above the partition there was a glass panel, and I was just tall enough where I could see through a glass panel. And I was watching what was going on. Well, to my great relief and pleasure, I saw my dad walking through the main door. My face was right up against the glass. And so we saw each other, and our eyes locked. He just went on to speak to the head Nazi. They had a brief conversation. And to my utter shock, my dad turned around and walked out of there, abandoned me to my fate, which I knew was not very good. A few hours went by, a few additional hours, and my dad came back. This time I was not so overjoyed to see him. But he talked to the head Nazi again, and this time something really strange happened. He stood there, and the head Nazi turned around on his heel and walked off. And my dad looked straight at me, and he went just like this. And I knew that he was summoning me. So I knew where the door was. I went out of there, and we walked out of there. Till this day, I see those faces of those children, and I can just imagine in my mind's eye that scene of all those hundreds of children. Well, I thought that those, and I frankly always thought, and continue to think, that I'm the only survivor of all those children. Well, I was interviewed about a year ago by the Holocaust Memorial Museum in Washington, D.C. And when I told that story to my interviewer, she looked shocked. And she said, no, there was not just one child roundup, as I thought. There were many child roundups. And I am the only known survivor of all these children roundups. Well, that was just one little experience. Things were starting to happen. Terrible things were happening right on the street, in plain sight, and to a lot of people. And my parents decided that we had to go to hiding. So initially, we hid above the theater ceiling. In every theater that you will see, look up and you'll see lighting equipment. You probably will see sound equipment. Well, between there, that ceiling, and the roof, there's a space. Usually the space is big enough so that technicians can walk there and adjust the equipment, install, remove the equipment. And we hid in that space above a theater ceiling. My dad was the project manager of that theater, so there was easy access for us. And we were safe until a maintenance worker doing something went up there to do something, and he saw us, and it was obvious that he saw us, and we knew that we were no longer safe. So we had to find another place, which we did. And my dad knew a lot of people involved, and there was a factory that had very heavy equipment. I remember walking into that factory. They moved a large machine. I had no idea what the machine was doing. And below that machine was a trap door to a secret basement. We went down to the basement, and when we arrived, there were maybe 3, 5, maybe 6 people in that basement. And so we felt very safe there. But my dad and the 2 engineers that ran that factory couldn't say no to other people that needed a safe haven. And so what started originally was maybe a 6 or 7 or 8 people, then became 10, and then 20, and then 25, and then 35, and then 41, maybe 50, 60, 75 people. Well, there was so much food that had to be brought down, and so much human waste that had to be taken out, that my dad knew sooner or later something was going to happen, and we're going to be found. So at that point, mom and dad changed their strategy. We got papers to indicate that we were Christian, and at night we snuck out of the ghetto, and we started living in the Christian community as Christians with these false ID papers. And we would move. People were desperate for money, so they would rent a spare bedroom in their apartment or house, and would move from one place to another. And as long as people were friendly, and of course they want to know who's in their place, in their home, and so they would ask us questions. And as long as the questions about general matters, etc., we'd be fine. But when the questions came up about religion, we knew it was time to move on, because one incorrect answer, our favorite pastor, or our favorite priest, I should say, is Father Smith. And Father Smith died last year, and that was an absolute giveaway that we were not Christian, we were not Catholic. And by the way, in Poland, Christian means Catholic, because that's basically it. At any rate, we'll move to the next place. One of the places that we moved to, the landlady got suspicious. Now, in those days, to give shelter to a Jewish person was death. That was the penalty for doing that. Well, this lady could have easily said to us, leave. We had effectively nothing. And so we would have just packed our one small bag and would have been gone in probably 30 seconds, no more than a minute. But this woman said nothing, and 2 police officers showed up at the door, and they said, "We have a report that you might be Jewish. We're going to take you downtown." I thought that they were taking us to the police station. I found the building many years later that we were taken to, and in fact, it was the Gestapo headquarters. And we were taken there by taxi, believe it or not police car, by taxi. And we stayed in a taxi. We were forced to stay in a taxi. One cop stayed with us, while the other one went in for instructions. And the German Gestapo, the Nazis, by the way, the Gestapo was the bad of the bad. They were real bad guys. And they said, well, they didn't look at us. They didn't examine us. They didn't question us. They said, take them across the street to the Umschlagplatz. By the way, in German, that means gathering place. And then we were taken there, which is directly across the street. And it was a railroad station. Now, as we were taken there, the station was almost empty. We didn't think there was anything unusual about that. Now, but let me back up for a second. When I said they didn't examine us, you see, in those days, it was very easy for anybody to find out whether, in fact, we were Jewish or not. All they had to do is say to me, drop your pants, open your fly. The only people that circumcised their boy babies were Jews at that time. Christians did not. And so when they sent us across the street, we could have been Christian. They didn't bother. As your teacher said in the introduction, 5 million others were killed, murdered along the side of the 6 million Jews who were murdered. This was a prime example. They just did not care. So we waited for a train, and we waited for a train, and we waited, and people were being brought to the railroad station all the time. And it got to be a little crowded, then it got a lot more crowded, and finally it was standing room only. At that point, I was 7 years old, and I found for the first time in a long time people my own age, friends, and instant friends. And we started running around and having fun, etc., and being very disruptive. And the Polish police, the Nazi German police, and the Jewish police, all three, agreed to take us, to certain disruptive children, to an orphanage in the Warsaw Ghetto. We were taken 2 by 2 out of the railroad station. Now, any other day but the day I was taken there, what would happen is anywhere between 1 and 3 trains went out of that railroad station to Treblinka. There were absolutely no survivors from Treblinka. The only people who survived were the slave laborers. But in terms of people that came in on trains, there were no survivors. 800,000 people were taken to that one camp. It's called a concentration camp, but it wasn't. It was nothing but other than a murder factory. In fact, let me tell you about it. Trains would pull up, and they would open the railroad, the cattle car doors, and tell people to get out, screaming and yelling. Any people that didn't get out, they would send people in with clubs to encourage folks to get out. If that didn't work, they would send police dogs in to encourage people to get out. One way or another, dead or alive, everybody got out. And then they were separated. Men went to the right, women to the left. Each group went through a warehouse. Anything that you had on you, a purse, a backpack, a suitcase, anything that you had with you went on a pile. Then the goods were sorted and sent to Germany. Then you went to another area where people were forced to disrobe. Once again, forced. And again, that clothing was recycled back to Germany. And then in groups of 300 to 500, people were forced to go into showers, ostensibly showers, but in fact they were gas chambers. Now, the gas chambers are so effective, so efficient, that the burial brigades, the slave laborers working in burial brigades, no matter how fast they worked, how hard they worked, they couldn't keep up. And the bodies started mounding up. And from mounds to little hills to big hills, the bodies were there sometimes for several days, or perhaps even weeks. Well, bodies started decomposing very quickly. And so the camp commandant stopped the trains so that the burial people could catch up with the people being murdered. And once that occurred, and it took 3 days, if I remember correctly, then the train started running again. It was either 3 or 5 days, and I was lucky. I was there on a railroad station for 2.5 of those. It was 5 days. For 2.5 days of those 5 days, and I left. Meanwhile, my mother volunteered to go on a work detail. She paid the guard some money, and he led her ostensibly, and I can tell you more about that if anybody's interested. He led her to escape. She joined my dad, told him my dad where I was, and anyway, she and my dad were out of German hands. Meanwhile, I was in this orphanage, doing very well, being very happy, until one day a man showed up in uniform. I trusted no one in uniform. And he said, "I am here to take you to your parents." Didn't know this man, and I sure was not going, didn't trust him. I was not going to go with him. He tried and tried. He tried to persuade me. The answer is no, always no. Finally, he said something to the adults in the orphanage, and they very gently, and I loved them and I trusted them, they very gently walked me out of the orphanage. Next thing I knew, the doors behind me were locked. I was by myself with this one man, and so I had to go with him. And here's what he did. He said, "No matter what you do, hold my hand and don't let go." And next, he put a cap on my head, pulled the brim way down, and he said, "Don't look up, don't say a word." And that's the way we move forward. Well, we walked down the main street of the Warsaw Ghetto, right up to the guard station. And all I could see was a platform where the guard stood on and a pair of boots. I was not permitted to look up, and I didn't. And so we were standing there, and the guard yelled down at us and said, "Who are you? What are you doing here?" And the guard said, "Oh, look at me. I'm a trolley car conductor, and I brought my son to see these Jewish people." The guard said, "You must be stupid. It's almost curfew." Curfew is usually about an hour after dusk, at the beginning of the dark period. And so he said, "You know that the patrols go out after curfew or at curfew, and they shoot on sight. Run home and pray that you can get home before the patrols get you." And that's the way I was snuck out of the Warsaw Ghetto. The man was good to his word. He dropped me off at my parents' house, and that's how I escaped the Warsaw Ghetto. After the war, or even later on during the war, I wanted to thank him, but certainly after the war, I wanted to thank him, or if he didn't survive, to thank his family. Couldn't do it. In those days, nobody gave their true name or address. So in case we were ever apprehended and we were questioned, tortured, they could torture us to death. We couldn't give him up. We didn't know who he was. And I don't know who he was to this day, but the man saved my life, and I wish I could thank him. After that, we went back to hiding in plain sight from place to place to place. And not too long after that, my dad was drinking beer with a Nazi. And let me back up a little bit. In Lvov, before we left Lvov for Warsaw, my dad knew a lot of people. He grew up there, etc. He went to a physician. He said, "You see this? This is my death warrant. Give me a nose job, a rhinoplasty." And the doctor said, "Well, you know, I can't take you to hospital. Jews are not permitted in the hospital. If I take you there, they'll shoot us both." My dad said, "Well, do it in your home. You got your little black bag. Do it." So the man said, I would like to help you if I could, but I can't because I don't have all the tools. I don't have any anesthetic. I don't have an assistant. My dad said, "Look, if you don't do it, not just I will die, but my wife is solely dependent upon me. She will die also." The man thought about it later, a little longer. He said, I just can't. And finally, my dad played his ace card. He said, "I have a 7-year-old son. He has no chance of survival without me. How would you like to think for the rest of your life that you're responsible for the death of a 7-year-old child?" And that's more than a doctor could handle. And so that night, my dad went to his house and literally held a tray for the pieces of flesh that come out of the nose, handed some tools to the doctor because the doctor only had 2 hands. My dad's only anesthetic was a half a bottle of vodka, and he got his rhinoplasty. Desperation can make you do some amazing things. At any rate, my dad's nose was so good, nobody ever suspected that he was Christian. Yeah, Jewish. He behaved like a Christian. He looked like a Christian. And to complete the makeover, my dad dyed his hair. So now he was blonde with a small nose, etc. And so he passed for not being Jewish. Anyway, he was socializing with this Nazi who moaned and groaned and said, "I've got this office in this Nazi headquarters building that I'm paying rent for. My company's no longer in business, and all I'm doing is paying rent." Without sounding too excited or excited at all, my dad said, "Well, I got a little company. I can use that space. I'll sublet it from you." And he did. And for the next 2 years, my mother and I hid in the closet in his Nazi headquarters building. There were people working all around us. So all day long, we were in this closet, and we sat on the opposite ends of the closet with our legs intertwined because there was just not that much space in the closet. And the only thing we could do was we had some white string like the bakers used to tie up a box full of goodies. And so we would play cat in the cradle. Some of you will probably know what cat in the cradle is and will tell the others. So you make patterns with the string with 4 hands, 2 hold, 2 make a pattern, and then the other 2 make another pattern. The only other things that we had in that closet were 2 pillows, not to sit on, not for comfort, but in case we had to cough, sneeze, or in any way make any sound whatsoever, since there were people working all around us, would bury our head in a pillow and contain the noise so that people couldn't hear because if anybody would hurt us, they would know immediately there's somebody in this allegedly vacant office, and that would be our deaths. And the only other thing that we had in our closet was a potty, and I'm not going to describe the reasons why we had the potty. At any rate, that went on for 2 years, and we were never discovered, even though there was never a lock on the closet. But with maintenance, people would come in, look around, see an empty office, leave. See security people, likewise, look around, see an empty office, leave. The only person that looked in the closet was right at the end. The Soviets were right at the edge of Warsaw. I mean, right at the outskirts, at the suburbs of Warsaw. And the Polish people wanted to liberate their own city. So they rose up against the Germans. The Soviets did not move forward, and there was fighting between the Poles and the Nazis. And this went on for months, actually for a month. And little by little, the Nazis regained control. But during that time, the air raid warden went to every room, every closet, opened every door, found us, never even thought that we would be Jewish, because by that time, all the Jews were allegedly dead. And we insisted we go down to the air raid shelter in the basement of this high-rise building. Well, we were there for about a day and a half when a huge bomb penetrated the entire building, and it landed about 30 feet from us. Had it exploded, we would have been vaporized. There would have been nothing to bury. But in fact, it did not explode. And I saw it, I looked at it, the nose was buried in the ground. I never saw anything but the beginning of the fins. It was that big. Many years later, actually, 2018, I went to the same place, and I actually saw where they repaired the concrete where that bomb came through. And at any rate, we had to leave that bomb shelter because perhaps that bomb could explode any time. So we went to another bomb shelter, and we went there crawling on our hands and knees because there were snipers all around. And so we had to be very close to buildings and to barricades so the snipers wouldn't shoot us. And as soon as we arrived in the other bomb shelter, for me, something terrible happened, because I was always as close to my mother. I could reach out, and I could always touch my mother by just reaching out. Always within an arm's length she was. And they moved my mother about 30 feet. And if that wasn't bad enough, I stayed in the main area of the cellar, and they put her into a side area. And if that wasn't bad enough, they dropped the sheet between us. Now, in about 1994, 3 or 4, we went to a cellar, we found a cellar. And in fact, my mother was in a coal bin. But of course, by that time, all the coal was gone. And my mother knew that I would be panic stricken. So every once in a while, she would say something to reassure me. And so that she told me that I'll be okay, that she was fine. And pretty soon I heard something which said to me sounded like a cat screeching. And I had never been with other children, or very little. And so I knew nothing. And so what I did not know is that so-called cat screeching were the birth cries of my baby brother. And my mother gave birth to my brother in a coal bin. My brother's birth weight was less than 2 pounds, less than 1 kilo. And my mother had no breast milk. There were no other women feeding babies, breastfeeding. And so everybody knew that this child was going to die. One doctor said, well, if you got to do something for him, give him some sugar water. That was a bizarre thing to have said because we hadn't seen sugar in 4 years. However, as far as I'm concerned, a miracle occurred because a burlap bag of sugar showed up, and we started feeding my brother 1 teaspoon of sugar water every half hour, whether he was asleep or awake, and he didn't die. And I thought that my brother's birth was my death because we got along, we survived by not being seen, by not being noticed. And with a newborn baby, everybody notices a newborn baby. But I was exactly 100% mistaken. In fact, everybody had to leave Warsaw and go through checkpoints. And we had no current papers, so we could not possibly survive this checkpoint examination. But in fact, one physician trying to save this baby, this minuscule, tiny baby, put us on a hospital train and bandaged up my mother's face so nobody could see that she looked Jewish. And we thought we were going to Germany. But in fact, that train went to Cracow, the very place from which we started. And in Cracow, all of a sudden, we came under the care and supervision of the Polish underground, the resistance. What we did not know was when my dad was getting these false ID papers saying that we were Christian, he was getting them from 2 people who were part of the resistance. But nobody said, hey, here's your uniform, you're now a part of the resistance. It was all unspoken. And so my dad got involved with them, bringing them business and money. And so the 3 of them went into business doing false ID papers and actually later on doing false ration cards and ration stamps. They were so good at doing that the Nazis could not tell the real ones from the fake ones. And these 2 men that my dad was working with were originated in the Bureau of Engraving of Poland. And they were making, before the war, they were making the Polish money. Now, of course, they're making false ID cards. Well, we went into a safe house, stayed there for 4 months, and then we were liberated in January, I believe. It's either January or February of 1945. And then, of course, liberation was nothing like the movies would have you believe. There were no jubilations in the streets, etc. Somebody went out, they couldn't see any Germans. They went out further, they couldn't see any Germans. And finally, we realized the Germans had withdrawn. And so the first issue that comes along is, hey, where do we find food? Second issue is, where do we sleep tonight? And so little by little, life gets back to normal. And that was the end of that. Now, we thought that the Soviets were our liberators, our friends, our champions. Little did we know. Because of my dad's work in the underground, he was offered and he took a job in the Polish government. And since he was an insurance man, he wanted to reestablish the insurance industry in Poland. Well, he would have to go where the insurance companies were. And the only functioning insurance companies were at the end of World War II were in Sweden, Switzerland, England. So he went to these places repeatedly to persuade people, these companies, to set up branch offices in Poland. But he came up in a Soviet radar, and one night, middle of the night, bang, 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 bang. And because my dad was an official in the Polish government, they gave him the privilege of getting dressed, and they dragged him off to a Polish jail. And from the jail, he was told he was going to be taken, that he was taken to Siberia. And they turned from prison to prison. And then he was helped to escape, join my mother. He escaped with the help of the underground. My mother told him where to meet, was told where to meet my dad. And they went off to Paris. Meanwhile, my mother sent my brother and I, in anticipation of my dad's escape, to walk towards Palestine before Israel came into existence. I knew to secrete myself so the Soviets couldn't find me. So I kept on using different names. And in my lifetime, I must have used maybe 100 false names. At any rate, my parents couldn't find us. They finally started looking for two children, ages 2 and 11. And we were about fourth, fifth, maybe sixth pair that they visited. They knew my route of travel. And so that's how we were reunited. Of course, at that point, my brother was sick. Of course, we were malnourished, and he was in the hospital. And when mom and dad found us, he didn't remember his own parents. And he actually panhandled for bread. About 5 months later, we came to the United States, and I was introduced to school in 5th grade, never went to 1st through 4th grade, maybe even the first half of 5th grade. And I was introduced in 5th grade without knowing how to read and write, no arithmetic. And my biggest impediment was I had no English. And with the help of my teachers, I was pretty well caught up by 7th grade. And for sure, I was caught up in 9th grade. Because by the end of, I don't remember, either my 9th or 10th grade, I was inducted into the National Honor Society. And I'm not that smart, but I tell this to students all the time, it's not how smart you are, it's how much you want it. My biggest complaint with teachers was they were never going fast enough for me. And I just wanted to learn. I wanted to learn everything. In fact, I still read only nonfiction, because if I'm going to spend the time reading, I want to learn. And I still read on 5th grade level. That's an impediment I've not been able to overcome. But what I wanted you to know is this: there's nothing that you cannot learn. It's a question of not how smart you are. It's a question of how much are you willing to put into it. If you're willing to work at it, you can learn just about everything. At least learn it adequately. One more thing I want to share with you, and that is, with the amount of trauma that I have experienced, there's no way that there could not be a residue. And I can tell you, even as late as last night, I still had nightmares. But as when I'm depressed, when I'm down, when I'm blue, for more than a couple of days, I reach out to one of the psychologists or psychiatrists or counselors or social workers that I use. And whether it's one session or a few sessions, we get it taken care of. I could not possibly live the kind of fulfilled, happy, full life and have this wonderful family that I have without the help of psychologists. And my message to you is, if you're ever blue, down, unhappy, more than a couple of days, there's an army of people out there waiting for you. That's their whole source. That's their livelihood. That's that's their sole purpose, to help you and me and people like us who need help. Don't be down. Don't be depressed for any extended period of time. There are people just waiting to help you. That's pretty much my story, and I would love to respond to some questions now.
Thank you so much, Mr. Hall. you show such courage, and that, you know, you can share with us this most intimate and painful recollection of your life during these horrific times. You know, your message will live on in these students and with all of us forever. There are many students who have made comments that are just sending thanks and gratitude for sharing. Some of the students want to know, how did you have so much courage during this time?
Well, that's easy. That's very easy. When a choice is do it or die, you do it, unless you want to die. And I never wanted to die. My parents didn't want to die. So for us, it wasn't courage, it was survival. For that matter, long-term planning was, how do we survive that day? Usually we were trying to figure out, how do we survive the next 5 minutes, the next hour? That was the idea of planning. Words like courage, hope, they didn't exist. Survival is all we've dealt with.
That kind of leads into another student's question that wanted to know, at any time, did you ever give up the idea of being able to survive, or were you convinced the whole time that you were going to survive this?
We couldn't think any further than maybe at the end of the day. The goal was to survive. And the goal was to survive. The goal was to win. And by the way, every day that we survived, we prevailed over the Nazis, because the Nazis' expressed purpose was our death and the death of every Jew who ever lived, not just in Europe, anywhere. Their goal was to kill every gypsy, every Roma person who ever lived. Their goal was to murder every communist, every free thinker, anybody who opposed them. Their goal was to murder. I'm trying to remember a Christian religious group. I don't remember whether it's Seventh-day Adventist, any one of the Christian sects. They, one of the things that when we speak of Holocaust, we speak of the 6 million, the 11 million. But mind you, in Europe during the World War II, 80 million people died. Of those, 6 million were Jews. And the point I'm trying to make is this: when the evil genie gets out of the bottle, none of us, Jew, Christian, Muslim, Buddhist, none of us are safe. We're all in mortal danger.
Thank you. A lot of students are wondering if you ever had any contact with anyone that you met during your experience during the wartime as an adult. Were you ever able to reconnect with anybody who may have helped you or that you met along the way?
Well, yes. Let me tell you a story about my grandmother. My dad's mom, by the way, my mother's family, the Germans were very efficient. You're looking at what's left of my mother's family. That's it. I'm it. I and my children. On my dad's side, my dad was the youngest of 6. He had 2 brothers in New York. Of course, they survived. A sister in Argentina who also survived, and a brother and sister in Poland who did not survive the war. My grandmother, my dad's father died in 1934. My dad's mother was alive when the Nazis occupied her town, Lvov. And she had a maid, and the maid said, she knew what they had in mind for Jews. And so she said she was willing to take my grandmother up in the mountains and pass her off as her own grandmother. My grandmother was an educated woman, etc. She said, no, the Nazis are okay. They won't hurt me. I'm a little old lady. They won't hurt me. They won't hurt me. Well, it went back and forth, and when the Nazis got bad enough, the maid and my grandmother went up the mountains. And the only way my grandmother could pass as a mountain woman was that she passed as a deaf mute. So when the city officials came by or the Nazis were interrogating her, she went, and so she mimicked being deaf mute, and she actually survived the war that way. And of course, after the war, she looked us up, and we were shocked that she survived. And then she went to Argentina, where she spent the rest of her life with her daughter, my dad's brother, and she lived for many years afterwards.
Wow, that's unbelievable. Speechless. Some of the students want to know, besides doing this work and bringing awareness to young people, and I know you speak to adults as well, what did you do after the Holocaust, after you came to the United States?
Well, as I mentioned, I desperately wanted my education, and that was my sole objective. And the other objective was I wanted to be an American. And so when I got off the airplane, and my name at that time when I came to the United States, my birth name, by the way, is Adam Janush Horowitz. When I got off the airplane, my name was still Adam Janush. It was Horsky. It was the last of our phony names. And my uncle said, Adam, that's not an American name. Well, I wanted to be an American. I would desperately want to be an American. So I asked, what's an American name? And my uncle said, Allan. And as of that moment, I became Allan. I didn't know how to spell it. I spelled it every which way. And today I spell it Allan solely because I thought it was the most sophisticated of the four common ways of spelling Allan. I worked very hard at becoming an American, becoming educated. And I went to university, got a degree in actually construction engineering. I have a degree in bachelor's of building construction. And then subsequently, I got a law degree. And my next objective was to build a career, which I did. Actually built 3 careers as a construction engineer right here in Miami, and subsequently as a lawyer in Atlanta, and last as a professor in a university, at University of Florida, and at a university in Georgia. So what did I do? Well, I lived the life and built a family. I have 2 daughters and married a woman with a 3rd daughter, so we have 3 daughters, 4 grandchildren, and life is good.
It's amazing. Your success is absolutely amazing. Let's see, we have so many questions. Do you ever encounter anybody who questions your experience or doesn't believe? And if you do, how do you handle that?
Well, there are 2 kinds of people that I've met. The first kind that really hurt me very badly, and those were the older Holocaust survivors who perhaps for the most part were in concentration camps. And they would say, you're not in a concentration camp, you're not a real survivor. I lost my childhood. I had a rather bizarre experience in schooling. I had psychological issues, etc. And they told me that I was not a real survivor. Well, so I didn't compete with them. And I really did not start speaking about my experiences until about 15 years ago, when one day, and I spent a lot of time just thinking, one day I came to the conclusion that these older survivors were getting old, feeble, perhaps dying. And as long as one of us is alive, somebody is, it's my obligation to speak. It's not a matter of choice. It's my obligation to speak. And so I've been speaking ever since. I've lost your question. I'm so sorry. Can you repeat it?
Yes, students wanted to know how do you handle when somebody questions
Oh,
your
yes,
story?
yes. So at first I got out of the way of the older survivors. And the second person, and I've had very few of these maybe a couple, who deny the Holocaust. Now, I've never had anybody who denied my experience in the Holocaust, but who denied the Holocaust. And my reply is very simple. You've seen all the movies, and they're on television, they're everywhere. The pictures, the films, etc. You know, the first thing the Nazis did is took our cameras away. Anything that we had valuable, they took away. So all of the film, all of the stories, all of the pictures that you see, they were taken by the Nazis. They documented their own crimes. And so the wrongdoers have given you all of the testimony, all the evidence. And if you choose not to believe that, you're just lying to yourself. I don't have the time I don't want to waste my time on somebody who insists on lying to himself or herself. And that's my reply.
Very nice, very strong. Another student, actually a few students asked, over the years of building your life and having your success, does dealing with the memories become easier? I know you mentioned that as recently as last night, you had nightmares. And students also wonder, how does sharing this experience affect you emotionally, even now?
Well, it's making it somewhat easier, or did make it somewhat easier, because at first I could never get through a presentation like this without breaking down and crying. By retelling it over and I've done it now probably hundreds of times, it's made it easier for me to talk about it. But you know, I still think about those children. I still see those children. I'm still sad much of the time. Thank goodness I'm married to a woman who is, by the way, is psychological training. And so sometimes she helps me. But, you know, that's something you can limp through life. And that's what I've done.
I think you've done more than that.
Yeah.
There are questions about your baby brother, born at just 2 pounds, barely survived. You cared for him on a journey many, many miles. Did your brother survive?
Yes, he survived. And all of us, by the way, at least one half of us in the family are lawyers, including his son, my daughter, now my granddaughter's in law school. My wife is a lawyer. My brother, though, in his practice of law, he was a trial lawyer, and he represented people who were victims of trauma, of terrorism, and he sued countries and got huge judgments. For example, he has a judgment against Cuba for $2.3 billion. That's what a B. And he was a very successful lawyer. And he died on the 75th birthday in 2019.
Wow. Let me see if I have any other questions. There's a lot of students that want to know, I think you mentioned that you've been back to Poland, but students want to know a little bit more about that. How did it feel being there?
Well, it's a set of weird experiences. Sad. I can never shake the thoughts of the 6 million, 11 million, 80 million people that died in World War II, that were murdered in World War II. You know, 6 million Jews that were murdered, they were murdered not because of where they were or what they did. They were murdered just because they were. They could have been perfectly good people. Most of them were. And just because they were Jewish, they were murdered. I was there one time in the street, and I had a distinct feeling that I felt the ghosts. And I'm not a believer in ghosts, but one time I felt the ghosts. Here's another thing that your students might be very interested in. And that is, every time I go back, I learn a piece of my own story. What I've told you, I've learned in bits and pieces from the time that I've read, I have looked, I have visited. For example, when I said I thought I was being taken to a police station, I thought I was being taken to a police station. I found out, until I found out there was a concentration camp on the edge of Lvov. I thought I was being taken to a police station until I found out that no, I was being taken to the Gestapo headquarters in Warsaw. Why? Because I saw the building. When I made inquiries, I found out it was the Gestapo headquarters. So I'm still learning bits of my own story.
I just got another question from a student who wants to know, I mean, your whole experience was horrific and traumatic, but wants to know what would you say would be the lowest point, the most difficult point that you encountered?
I was too to mind. When I was 7 years old, a Nazi had me, and they put me at the back of the truck, and I knew they were going to kill me. By the way, the little kids in your lives, the 5-year-olds, the 6, the 7, the 8, 9, 10-year-olds, if there's danger, I assure you, they know that danger. They may not know the specific nuances of that danger, but they can feel it, they can hear it. It's transmitted from the adults. They know the risk. They know death. They know death. Not just as a word, they know death, just as the adults do. I'm sorry. I guess I'm getting a little bit upset. Please repeat the question.
It's okay. And we're gonna wrap up in just a minute.
No, that's okay.
The question was, what would you feel was your lowest, most difficult point in time?
When I was put on the back of the truck, when I left those children to die, when my dad got me out. And the other time was a very strange time when, for a long time, when I would tell the story, I'd break down. What happens was we were walking from Cracow to Lvov. There was a moment in time when nobody would feed us, and we were hungry. And it was I think August or September, right about that time of the year, and the corn was pretty much full in the fields, and we had to resort to stealing raw corn in order to eat something to stay alive. While we were stealing this corn, and I'm not talking about a whole lot of corn. Here we're talking about 2 adults and a child, so maybe at most 5 ears of corn. The farmer saw us, and he just turned around and walked away and let us steal his corn. And the idea that we had to resort to stealing just to stay alive, that really hurt me a lot. But you do what you have, whatever it is, to stay alive.
Yeah. 2 more questions. Students are asking about forgiveness. If presented with the opportunity, or have you ever thought about, do you forgive the atrocities that were done against you and the Jewish people?
Yes and no. And in this respect, I have been frequently asked, how do I feel, what do I feel about Germans? And my response is, I've been to Germany many times. I thoroughly enjoy Berlin. And I have nothing against Germans, because the Germans that I'm with today, or even 20 years ago, were not the perpetrators, were not the wrongdoers. Because at that time, the wrongdoers would have been, or today, if I'm 86 and I'm 86, the wrongdoers would have to be 106 or older. Not many of them alive. The point is, I don't blame a group of people. I blame individuals who do the wrong thing. And So there is no, as far as forgiveness, outright forgiveness, absolutely none. You don't forgive for that kind of atrocity. And so, no, there will never be a forgiveness, not on my part. But forgive whom? These people are dead, or they're so old that they're inconsequential.
Thank you. And the last question, we know you've given a lot of presentations. Students want to know, how many people do you think you've shared your story with? And you've mentioned this, but just to say again, why do you continue to do this work?
Because, well, let me first do the easy question. Yeah, I have given presentations to as few as one, because it's just as important, and as many as 6,000. I don't know, I'd have to guess. If you ask me for just a wild guess, I would say probably 100,000 people. That may be excessive. That's maybe 50,000, but it's certainly tens of thousands of people that I've reached out to. And why do I do it? Very simple reason. I started my presentation with that, and I'm going to finish it. So thank you is a perfect way for me to conclude. The reason why I think people should know about it is because it can happen to you. And I'm talking about, can't see your faces. Usually when I see people in person, I literally point at individuals. It can happen to you and you and you and you and you. You see, in January 6th, and now this is not a political statement at all. In January 6th, it might have happened here in the United States. We were so lucky. We can lose our form of government with just one event, because if a small group of people gain control, and then really the entire network, the entire system ceases to work. I hope that everybody that is listening, because this is probably the most important thing I have to say to you. Hitler was brought to power lawfully. Hitler was no member of junta, etc. He was brought to power by German law. Hitler, once in office, then manipulated to dissolve the parliament. How? He burned the Reichstag. Did that sound familiar to you? Burning Reichstag? The Reichstag, by the way, was the legislative branch of the German government, like burning the Capitol. And then he took the controls of all aspects of government. It can happen to you. And I urge you to be involved, to get involved, to stay involved. Mind you, most of the workers who are involved in political campaigns here in the United States are very young, certainly below 25 or 30. Most of the first-time candidates are very young, younger than 30. Don't just sit back and expect other people to do the heavy lifting. Being a citizen requires your effort, and I have an interest in this. I have a stake. I'm too old. It doesn't matter that much for me. But my children and my grandchildren, when you protect your liberty, your freedom, you protect my grandchildren's liberty and freedom, and my children's. For God's sake, if nothing else, vote, 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 vote. Never miss a vote.
Yes, amen to that. Even in our local elections, they all matter.
Right, absolutely.
Thank you so much, Mr. Hall. And thank you, students of Palm Beach Central High School. Your questions were remarkable. And I know that the students of Palm Beach Central are being taught to use their voices to rise up against any hatred or injustice. I'd like to bring back Mrs. Holzer, the social studies teacher from yep, there she is.
Here I am. Mr. Hall, I want to thank you so much, on behalf of myself, on behalf of all of my students, for taking the time to share your story with us and particularly for your powerful message. My students will tell you, I beat into their heads, with rights come responsibility, and they need to be a good citizen, and they need to be aware because the danger is out there. So I so appreciate your final statements. It really resonates with what I've been trying to teach my students. In closing, I'd also like to thank Ms. Kimberly Combs for helping to organize this remarkable event, and for John Shoemaker, who his technical savvy allowed us to do this. And finally, to thank Ms. Butler and Mr. Edgecombe for always supporting me and supporting my program and supporting the students in Holocaust Studies. So I thank all of you very, very much for being here. I thank you again from the bottom of my heart, Mr. Hall, for sharing your story. It was very moving and very worthwhile, and I hope that my students walk away with your message. Mr. Edgecombe, did you want to say something?
Ms. Holter, I think you said it all. The only thing I wanted to add to it is that I'm absolutely honored to have you on our staff and just be the driving force behind this message constantly being communicated to our students and staff. So thank you for the great work you do. You are irreplaceable here at Palm Beach Central High School. And thank you again, Mr. Hall. I was extremely moved by every word you said. It was very powerful, and I'm honored to have met you.
My pleasure.
Okay, so I guess we're not quite finished with period 4. So Mr. Edgecombe, shall we have the students go back to their period 4 and and we'll make an announcement?
I would probably actually just keep the kids in the cafeteria. I would just leave them where they are to limit the movement, since we have coverage in there. And obviously the kids that are virtual can log off.
Okay, so I'll see my students later this afternoon. Thank you all for coming. Thank you all for listening. And we so appreciate everything that you all do.